Good morning. It's great to be with all of you again this morning. Our devotional thought for today comes from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life, to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life, to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Mahalah, as prophet in your place." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, the second half of this passage is probably more familiar to most of you than the first. And the passage right before this one is also pretty famous. But it's really important for us to situate this passage in the context of that one. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of 1 Kings chapter 18. So in it, Elijah has this massive confrontation with 400 prophets of Baal, where they have 2 altars set up with wood and a sacrifice bowl on top. And the prophets of Baal try to get fire to come down and light the sacrifice with, as you may know, no success. They do a lot of crazy stuff like cutting themselves and dancing and shouting really loudly in an attempt to get Baal to light the fire. But no matter what they do, Baal doesn't answer. However, Elijah has them pour a total of 12 jars of water on his sacrifice, and then he says one short prayer, and the wood that has been drenched in water, as well as the sacrifice and even the stones of the altar, are consumed by this fire. It's this awesome moment where the faithfulness of Elijah, coupled with the power of God, result in an all-consuming fire that causes all the people there to worship God. This moment is immediately followed up with another powerful moment. At this point, there has been a drought in Israel for about 3 years, but Elijah bows down while he tells his servant to go look at the sea 7 times. On the 7th time, the servant sees a small cloud. This cloud develops into a mighty storm with wind and heavy rain. The drought has finally ended. It's these two incredibly high moments right after another, where God shows himself to Elijah and to the Israelites, first in fire and then in wind and rain. And these moments, I'm sure, filled Elijah with strength and hope. I mean, the people who have been worshiping Baal worshiped God again because of this scene. And the king was witness to all of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if Elijah thought, yes, finally, this is when things are going to get better. The king and the people will turn back to God, and things are finally going to change. And then you have this passage. Instead of Ahab going back and trying to turn things back to God, he goes and tells his wife what Elijah has done. And Jezebel proceeds to threaten Elijah. And instead of Elijah having faith in the strength of God that he just witnessed, he flees. He goes out into the wilderness, and this man of God, whose prayers have been consistently answered up until this point, prays that God will take his life. Elijah is in such a dark place that he prays he will die because he thinks he has failed, just like his ancestors in the same wilderness did. He has been devoted and zealous for God. He has given it his all. I mean, do you not see what he has just done? That's not giving it your all. I don't know what is. But it doesn't seem to matter. He feels alone. He feels abandoned. And he feels like he's failed. Even after all of that, the people aren't turning back to God. So he feels hopeless. What more powerful show could there be than what Elijah and God just did? If that doesn't work, what will? And yet, God doesn't seem to think Elijah has failed. Even though Elijah ran away and prays that he would die, God provides food and water for him. He gives him shelter so he can rest. God cares for him. First, for his physical needs. And then God says, look, I know you're hopeless and at the end of your rope. So go out from this cave and stand on the mountain where I revealed myself to Moses. I'm going to reveal myself to you too. And now comes the famous part of the passage. There's a great wind, but God doesn't show up in the wind. There's a great earthquake, but God doesn't show up in the earthquake. And there's a great fire, but God doesn't show up in the fire. Interestingly enough, we just saw God show up in fire and then show up in wind and rain in the previous chapter. So it's very clear that God can show up in those things and can and has used those things before. The story of Israel is filled with God performing mighty acts like this to show himself to Israel and to strengthen and encourage them. So why doesn't he here? Why does he instead choose the opposite, a still, small voice? Actually, according to the text, there is a sound of sheer silence, which is pretty contradictory. But if you've heard the phrase, the silence was deafening, then you probably can get a feel for what the passage is portraying. And Elijah seems to immediately recognize this silence as God, because he comes to the mouth of the cave, which is what he was supposed to do when the Lord was about to pass by. So why silence? Silence isn't particularly awe-inspiring. In fact, silence can feel awkward, uncomfortable, and even lonely. Like when we say the silence was deafening, we don't really mean that in a good way. Yet Elijah knows that God is in this noise, or rather, lack thereof, that makes us feel so lonely and uncomfortable. Why? I want to suggest this morning that the reason that God chose to show himself in silence, and that Elijah knew it was God, was because it was exactly what Elijah needed. Elijah already knew that God was there in the powerful moments, but he needed to know that God was there in the most despairing and in the loneliest of moments. He needed to know that even when he felt abandoned and like a failure, that God still cared, that God would still provide. That even when Elijah didn't care much for his life, God would feed him and strengthen him and show himself to Elijah. And that's what I want you to know as well. I want you to know that whether you're at your highest with God because you can see his mighty acts, or you're at your lowest because you feel like you're alone, God still cares. God is with you. He's with you in the highs. He's with you in the lows. He can show himself to you in fire, in wind, and in an earthquake, but he can also show himself to you in the silence. However he chooses to show himself to you, he is there. And just like Elijah, he can strengthen you so that you can finish your journey. I'm not going to close in prayer because I would like to ask you to consider taking a moment of silence instead once this video ends. And yes, this means not talking, but I'd also like to challenge you to quiet your mind. Something that I'm personally not good at, but something that I'm going to give a shot at, that I would like you to do as well. And yes, part of the point of the silence is to see if God will speak, just like he did to Elijah. Maybe like Elijah, he'll give you a new mission. But more than that, it is to remind you that even in the awkwardness and uncomfortableness of silence, God is there. He is always.